So there are 4 key messages I'd like to leave you with today from that publication. First of all, that the data about the distribution of income in Canada suggests that we're very good at sharing the economic pie, but we're less good at growing it. And at present growth rates, which have slowed quite a lot in advanced countries, but even more so in Canada, it's going to take us more like 4 or 5 generations to double real incomes, something that we used to do in 1 to 1.5 generations. And other countries are not standing still. Canada has not kept up with peer countries on productivity or living standards over the current business cycle since 2007. And so if we want these trends to turn around, it's time to have a conversation about what structural reforms we need to undertake as a nation to grow the pie. So the paper is called Keeping Up with the Joneses. Who are the Joneses? Well, they're advanced countries like ourselves with similarly educated workforces, similar institutions. For starters, the G7, America, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Great Britain. But we've also included there the 19 countries of the the Euro area, I should say, the 36 advanced countries that make up the OECD, and 2 other resource-based economies like ourselves with comparative advantages in resource development like Australia and New Zealand. And you know, when I moved to Canada some years ago from the UK actually, one thing I noticed here is that we get a lot of American rhetoric, we get a lot of American news, we get a lot of American policy discussions that influence our debate here. But the data for America and the data for Canada are not always alike, and the income distribution is one of those areas. So one of the best measures that we have of the distribution of income is what's called the Gini Coefficient. Now, without getting too technical about what it means, it summarizes the dispersion of income across the population. The closer it is to 0, the more equal incomes are distributed. The closer it is to 1, the more concentrated are incomes across the population. And when you compare Canada to the G7, Australia and New Zealand, we actually have the lowest Gini coefficient for market incomes and the 3rd lowest Gini coefficient for disposable incomes after taxes, government transfers and fiscal equalisation. So we're actually pretty good at sharing the economic pie. And BC ranks even better. We're actually even lower than the national average on the Gini coefficient for both indicators than Canada. So if we're good at sharing the economic pie, why are people feeling so anxious in Canada? Well, one reason is that incomes are not growing as they once did. Here's a measure of real wages. It's probably the best measure of real wages that we have. It's a total measure that includes bonuses, benefits, includes employer contributions to CPP and EI, and it's from the Statistics Canada productivity accounts. So this is real compensation per hour worked, and I've plotted here the 5-year averages. So it's the annual growth rate over 5 years. You can see that we used to grow real incomes at between 1.5% and 2.5% per annum. But over the last 5 years, we've only managed 0.6. So what do these numbers mean? Well, once upon a time, we were able to grow our real incomes and double them within about 1 to 1.5 generations. That's what we can achieve when we can grow real wages between 1.5% and 2.5% per annum. So our children or our grandchildren are experiencing double the real incomes that we have today. But at our current growth rates, if we sustain these growth rates of 0.6% per annum as we've done over the past 5 years, it's going to take something like 4 or 5 generations to double real incomes. So now we're talking about our great-great or our great-great-great-grandchildren. It's a big difference. And other countries aren't standing still, as I mentioned. In our publication, we compare Canada's position on living standards, of which the GDP per person is a key measure. We compare ourselves between 2007, which was the peak of the last business cycle, and 2018, which is the last year. And we're looking at real GDP per person as a percent of US levels compared to the Joneses. Germany, New Zealand, Australia, the Euro area and the OECD have all improved their real GDP per person as a percent of US levels, while the United Kingdom, Japan, Italy, and especially Canada have all slipped back. In fact, Canada has slipped the most among peer countries. So in relative terms, our living standards are not keeping up with other advanced countries. Now, GDP per capita is derived arithmetically. It's a function of hours worked per capita, which is labour utilisation, and GDP produced per hour, which is labour productivity. We talk a lot about labour utilisation in Canada. We talk about unemployment. We talk about population. We talk about labour force participation. None of that has contributed to GDP per person improvements over the last 11 years. The elephant in the room is our productivity performance. This is where we've lost ground. Our labour productivity, or GDP per hour worked, is now 5 percentage points lower relative to US levels compared to where we were in 2007 versus today. While countries like Australia, Germany, and the euro area as a whole have all moved ahead. Even France has moved ahead. Japan, the United Kingdom, as it struggles with Brexit, and especially Canada, have all slipped back in terms of their output per hour produced. So I'm going to show this chart over time. I used this chart last year. This is just showing it in time. We start in 1970 with Canadian productivity levels around 87% of US levels. So this is GDP per hour worked. And as we march along, Canada is around 90%, but then it starts to drift in the 1990s into the mid-80s, and then it's the low 80s, and then it's the high 70s, and then it's the mid-70s. Just to show that again. And you watch other countries like Germany and France and the UK all start from behind where Canada was in the 1970s and all move up and converge with the United States on the technological frontier. So if we don't want these trends to continue and we're concerned about them, what do we do? Well, we've just had a federal election, and I think it's fair to say that the major parties steered a wide berth around serious economic policy discussions about the challenges that Canada faces, which is a missed opportunity, in my opinion. One of the first things we need to do is to comprehensively review the tax system. The last time Canada looked at its national tax system was the Carter Commission in the 1960s. Australia, I showed you the productivity performance from Australia. Australia's had four major tax reviews in the last 20 years. Now, we have taxes, they have output costs, inefficiencies. We need to review where those inefficiencies lie and find out ways to reduce them. We need to ensure that the tax system is progressive in an overall sense, as the data I showed you earlier on the income distribution suggests that we already do a pretty good job on that, and we need to continue doing so. And we also need to simplify our tax system. Our regulatory regimes should be modern, they should be streamlined, they should be simple, and they should be certain. We should reduce the trade barriers that we have from trading with ourselves. Our product markets should feature vigorous competition between companies that are innovating, that are training their staff, that are taking Canada forward into the 21st century. And we need to attract and retain top talent to make all of that possible. So to come back to my messages at the very beginning, Canada is good at sharing the economic pie. We're just not very good at growing the pie. We need to get better. At present growth rates, it's going to take 4 or 5 generations to double real incomes, something that we used to achieve in less than 2. And other countries are not standing still, they're not waiting for us. Peer countries over the last 11 years have moved ahead of Canada on productivity and on living standards. So, it's time for Canada to consider a structural reform agenda to address these economic challenges, and we hope that today is a step in that direction. Thanks very much.